In 1759, France and Britain were locked in the 7 Years' War. It was a war of global proportions. In Europe, Russia, India, and the American colonies, the two countries fought to establish who was the dominant world power. In November 1759, with the outcome of the war finally balanced, France decided to try and land a killing blow. They would invade Britain. The success or failure of this invasion would come down to a single giant naval battle, fought in gale-force winds in the seas between Britain and France. Hello, my name is Gareth Edwards and welcome to the Untitled History Podcast. Join me each week alongside world-leading experts as we take a deep dive into your favourite topics from throughout history. From the ancient world to the modern, and with plenty of historical rabbit holes in between, we'll cover famous and not so famous moments in history from all across the globe. Mostly forgotten today, the Battle of Quiberon Bay is one of the most important naval battles in British and European history. One that accelerated the chain of events that would lead to American independence, the rise of Napoleon, and British dominance of the seas for the next 150 years. And I'm delighted to say that my guest who talk about this with me today is naval historian Alex Pocklington, better known to some of you, I'm sure, as Drakinifel.
Hello.
So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, honestly, when we were talking about this and when we were talking about stuff to do, there was no one else I'd rather do this one with for reasons I suspect that will become somewhat obvious to people as we progress. There is a certain ship that's going to get a mention that comes up, and people we're familiar with will know why. But yeah, I mean, I think we're both agreed, aren't they? This is a bit of a forgotten important battle, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely pivotal. To be honest, the 7 Years' War gets pushed into the background a little bit by the later revolutionary and Napoleonic wars, but Quiberon is such a vital part of this war, and as you said, it sets in motion a chain of events that actually dictates not just how the rest of that war is going to go, but because of the knock-on effects of that war, pretty much how the rest of the 18th and 19th centuries are going to go. Obviously, you get later battles like Trafalgar that help to refine that. But also, it's pretty much my favorite age of sail naval battle, based purely on the visuals of it. And there's precious few paintings of it, but the minute you start to research it and look into the descriptions that are described in the deck logs and everything of what actually is going on, if you put this into a movie, it would be one of those things where you would have to tone down some of the stuff that actually happened because people would otherwise think you were making it up.
Oh, totally. I think that's it. It's pure cinema, this as a battle. And Mahan, the big kind of the French sort of legendary naval kind of theorist and expert, I think he's the guy who describes it as Trafalgar before Trafalgar. So for those who are unfamiliar with the 7 Years' War, I'm just going to set the scene on this. So we're right in the middle of it here in 1759, and this is a war between Britain and its ally Prussia, who it's funding heavily to fight the land war on its behalf, and France, and at points, Austria, Spain, and a bunch of other people. And these countries are all monarchies at this point. This is, as you said earlier, Alex, is pre-revolution here. But it's really a war to establish who's the dominant power. And it's been going back and forth for a while at this point. But what it's really hit is a period where the French know that if they're going to beat the British, they have to invade, don't they? That's the real thing here.
Yeah, because Britain is basically using the game plan that it's been using pretty much since the rise of the sort of the cannon-armed ship as the primary means of war fighting, and which they'll continue to use pretty much up until the First World War, and to a certain degree even in the First World War, which is use the Navy to safeguard Britain's own shores, lock off access to the sea to the other side using blockade. And then once that blockade is established, Britain can not only trade with the rest of the world and generate a ton of money, but it can also trade with all the bits of the world the other side was trading with and generate even more money. Meanwhile, the other side doesn't have the money from the international trade economy. And therefore, Britain will have more money than the other side, which over a long period of time essentially means if you can't invade Britain, Britain will eventually either outbuild you, or as you said with the Prussians, they'll just keep paying other people to fight you on land.
They are basically, in gaming terms, the most annoying Europa Universalis 4 player ever. They will just fund people to fight you if they don't want to fight you themselves. And this is truly a global war. I think that's what people don't necessarily realize. I mean, there's fighting everywhere. It's building on the American, what's called the American Indian Wars, which of course is really the colonial fight that's happening in America. Russia's involved with it. And as you say, this is trade, this is everything. I mean, France at this point is spending about 60% of its national budget to service its national debt that has been built up precisely because of the blockades you describe. And that's what leaves them in this position of needing to invade. This is something that always fascinates me, and I always think you explain this really well, is I don't think people necessarily, the Channel is not a big sea, and you'd think it's easy to kind of cross it in both directions because the amount of times that Britain has invaded France is pretty high. But the amount of times that France has pulled off an invasion of Britain despite superior resources is much lower. And do you want to give, like, maybe, I think it'd be really nice to get, if you would just, why is it so hard to invade Britain from France?
Yeah, so it's basically a tyranny of geography. You've obviously got tidal currents that sweep up and down the channel every day. But when you look at that, you've kind of got surface currents, but then you have the deeper currents. And when you look at the deeper currents and the way that material gets moved up and down the channel, there is a gradual flow from the west going to the east, down at the seabed level. And because the general drift of this is kind of from southwest to northeast, what you end up with is the Brittany Peninsula being France's own worst enemy, because it creates a kind of little shield. And the Cherbourg Peninsula, to a lesser extent, does this further up the channel. And that means that the waters off of the north coast of France are relatively calm, which is great for fishing and all kinds of small boats. But it's terrible for the formation of deep water ports, because with very slow water, you get a huge amount of deposition from silt and stuff that's being carried out by rivers, stuff that's being moved up by the sea. And so you end up with these lovely, gentle, sloping beaches that go on forever and a day. But it means that you look at any depth chart of the northern French coast, and almost all of it is, less than 20 feet for hundreds of yards out, possibly even miles. The flip side is that the south coast of Britain, for a large part of it, is exposed, which scours the area, which is why we have a lot of pebble beaches as much as we have sand beaches. But that means that it creates quite a lot of deep water ports where you have hard rock occlusions that don't erode, and the soft rock around it erodes, and then suddenly you've got a headland that's protecting a bay, and now you have all your various ports, a lot of them obviously, Portsmouth, Exmouth, Weymouth, all the various mouths, Bournemouth, they're all at the mouths of rivers that have carved out these little deep water ports. So that means that Britain has, or England earlier on, has a number of good deep water ports in the channel. So they can base fairly substantial warships out there. France doesn't have that. And so they can't base their own war fleet in the channel, basically once warships advance much beyond, maybe 10, 12-foot draft. So that's why earlier on, Norman invasion, part of the medieval period when it's cogs and everything, there is quite a lot of back and forth between the navies in the channel. The minute you end up with a deep draft vessel, particularly one carrying guns, you can't really base much of anything in the French ports. And so the French then have to base their closest heavy fleet can be based in Brest on the southwest side of the Brittany Peninsula, which geographically is fairly close to Britain, but it means that if they want to get out to come round to invade, because obviously they're all sail-powered, they have to rely on a wind coming from somewhere in the direction of the east, heading west to get them out, but then they have to hope that the wind will change direction to bring them back into the channel.
This is the thing, isn't it? That and we'll see this will play out in this battle as be a critical part of this battle. But as you say, for those trying to picture where we're talking about these places, so if you imagine, as Drax says, the sticky out bit on the France that stretches into the Atlantic Sea, the Brittany Peninsula, Brest is beneath that. It's on the underside of that. So yeah, if you want to attack Britain from there, as you say, you need the wind to drive you out almost into the borders of the Atlantic. Then you need it to change and you need it to come back.
Yeah, and the British can anticipate that.
Yeah.
They've got scouts usually off of Brest, and with an easterly wind, the British fleet can come out and just sit at the entrance of the channel and go, okay, well, come at me. And even if they miss that, a westerly wind, well, if they're in the channel, they can still sail out of their ports. And yes, it makes it slightly more vulnerable, but realistically, during a lot of the age of sail, you've got places like Plymouth and Dartmouth, which are hosting fleets. And as long as they can physically leave the port, which they can, really the only area that's of mainland England that's really vulnerable to invasion is Cornwall. And especially in an area without mechanized transport, yes, you could theoretically land troops in Cornwall if you can find somewhere suitable to actually put them ashore. But you're hundreds of miles away from anywhere that's actually important with a very difficult supply line. So no one ever tries to do that. They all try and force their way into the channel, which is where the Royal Navy is waiting for them.
And this kind of plays into sort of one of the key architects behind this is the Duc de Choiseul, who is he's foreign minister of France at the time for the king, but he's sort of, it's best to think of him as prime minister in modern terms. His first plan to invade Britain is to try and launch from that coast and just cross in shallow barges with large force and hit the south coast of England. That kind of gets scuppered because, as you say, Drac, like the British know what's going on. As throughout history, they will try and scupper this, just as they do later with the Sea Lion in World War II. They destroy the barges. There's a wonderful raid by Admiral Rodney who goes in 330 invasion barges he destroys. And that forces them to fall back on a more traditional plan, this more traditional approach of starting in that bottom of the Brittany Peninsula in Brest, gathering an invasion fleet in Vannes, which is, and everyone in Britain is going to hate me for describing it this way, it is the armpit of France. If you want to visually think of it, because you can't gather everything in Brest because it's really hard to get resources out there. So you've got this invasion force of troops gathering in Vannes. You've got Brest, where they're trying to concentrate the war fleet further out. And the plan is really take 20,000 troops from there as almost a vanguard and try and dump them in Ireland or in Scotland and then come down or over in a way that way. But that's the plan. But the British know this is happening, don't they?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we sort of, I guess this is a good place to introduce the British protagonist of the final battle, which is Admiral Hawke. So Hawke's worked his way up through the Royal Navy as a competent, innovative, and aggressive officer. So he's been present at numerous battles against the French, and a lot of the time he's been outnumbered and outgunned. One of his earliest battles, he not only was the British fleet outnumbered and outgunned, but it was also betrayed by one of the subsidiary admirals who refused to get involved. So it was essentially the main admiral, Matthews, and Hawke, and about 3 or 4 other ships trying to fight the entire French fleet. So he's very, very experienced, but he's also begun a system which actually allows for constant blockade, because previous to this, the British have kind of sent squadrons to blockade the French ports, and then those squadrons have run out of food, water, and had to drop back. And they've had to rely on the occasional frigate or something, which can provide a permanent scouting presence. But what Hawke actually introduces is a system of supply ships which sail from British ports to restock and resupply these ships at sea, which means that essentially the duration of any particular ship on blockade is limited purely by how long the hull lasts in the Atlantic weather. And obviously that varies depending on each ship, but when you're only having to detach maybe 1 or 2 ships every month to go back to get refitted, you can send out 1 or 2 ships every month to reinforce the blockade. So he's managed to enact this system whereby a continuous blockade can be maintained. And if you can have a continuous blockade at the main ports, that means the frigates that you would previously have used to scout those main ports can now be distributed along the French coast. And that means that essentially anything that moves along the coast of France or in any of France's ports very quickly ends up back in Britain, and they know roughly what the French are going to do.
I legit think at some point you and I need to sit down and do an episode here on just the history of British blockading via navies, because, as you say, this is almost the beginning of a period of Britain absolutely mastering the art of how they blockade. It will go from this through the Napoleonic Wars with the introduction of lemons from Sicily and effectively Britain accidentally creating the mafia in the process. But it goes right up to First World War and how critical it is in that. And as you say, I think Hawke is fascinating because he's so good at his job, and he is unbelievably aggressive, and that's gonna play into events later. I mean, I want to give a shout out to some other names that be there. So I'm massively against going down like reading off lists of ship names and everything else. But I think there is a few. If you are into that thing, and you just go on Wikipedia and read the list of ships and the list of captains, there is a bit of a who's who of naval history over the next 50 years that kind of sits there in the captain names on the British ships, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah. There's so many that will they distinguish themselves in this battle, but a lot of it's quite funny. A lot of the time, you see names and you realize that these are where they're first fighting, but they will do such a good job here and in the future that they themselves will then have ships named after them in the Royal Navy afterwards.
Yeah, I love it for that. It's like you read down the list of captains, and it could be a list of World War One destroyers and battleships.
Yeah, and some of them you see also massive legacies that are going on all down through the ages. So there's a few. There's descendant of Francis Drake.
Yeah,
He's in
commanding
command of one of the ships.
HMS Falkland, I think.
Yeah, you've got a Captain Arbuthnot, and now of course one of his more distant descendants won't necessarily cover themselves in glory at Jutland, but it shows you just how long that legacy lasts. You've got one of the many representatives of the Hood family. They're there. Strachan, again, there's multiple Strachans that you'll see down the line. And it goes on. And, a lot of these people have said, well, there'll be admirals in the Napoleonic Wars.
And I think you've also got, Charles Hardy, I think, is effectively there. He's an admiral, I think, at this point. He's sort of the second in command, effectively. He'll eventually be governor of New York. But, of course, he's uncle to a Hardy that everyone knows from Trafalgar. It's a who's who of naval families, and I think that speaks to the level of experience that the Royal Navy has at that time that's in this blockade, that will be present in this battle, and that's going to be so critical to how things develop. This isn't a navy by this point that is. Tradition is a real thing. Tradition. It's so skilled all the way down that it makes a huge difference. On the French side, we have the Comte de Conflans, which is Hubert de Brienne, and I think it is worth pointing out that he's a very experienced naval officer as well. We'll talk about it a bit later. I kind of feel like he doesn't do anything wrong in this battle, but the French are sort of fighting at a disadvantage, aren't they? Just because they're just not quite as good at as the British.
Yeah, so the French have two major problems when it comes to their naval forces. Well, technically there's a third, which is more general, which is obviously that France has to maintain a very large army. And if any nation is trying to maintain a very large army and a navy, they have to decide which is the more existential. And of course, France being a land power in Europe, the army is the priority. The navy is never going to be their premier institution, which means that therefore, some of their best officers are going to go into the army rather than the navy. The next problem that they have, well, the other two problems which are more directly related to this battle and this war, is that one, when the French lose some of the really big battles, both in the early part of this war and in previous wars, part of the problem is that they take very heavy casualties, both in terms of killed and wounded and in terms of those captured, which obviously Britain isn't very keen on giving back. And that massively depletes their stock of experienced sailors. So whereas, if you fight a massive naval battle, 30, 40 ships aside, if one side loses 2,000-3,000 men killed, wounded, captured, that's a huge chunk of your experienced sailor corps gone. If the other side loses a few hundred, they can replace those. And that obviously then means in the next battle, the side that lost relatively few is in an even stronger position, and it just keeps spiraling up from there. Couple that with the blockade. The blockade, of course, means that British ships are spending a lot of time out at sea, so their crews are getting trained, they're getting real-world experience in how to sail in all kinds of weathers, they're being drilled, partly to increase their skill, partly just to stave off boredom. The French sailors, on the other hand, are spending a lot of time in port, so even if you have some experienced sailors and some relatively new recruits, there's not a huge amount you can do. Sure, you can do some drills in port, but nothing beats the real practical experience of being out at sea. And so skills end up atrophying. And that means that you can have some extremely brave men and particularly brave and competent officers in the French Navy. But there is a limit to what they can do with the crews that have been provided to them.
And when we're talking crews here, I mean, for those, if you've got in your head, listener, this image of like ships are run by 50 people or whatever else, no, I mean, you're off by a factor of 10 here. I mean, we're talking that the amount of manpower that, say, the French Navy needs to be effective at this point. We're talking 25,000, 30,000 very good trained sailors. And that's not everyone who's in the Navy. This is the core of real experience you need to run a Navy. And they're not helped by the fact that in the year run up to this, and one of the reasons they're gathering the invasion fleet at Vannes, not at Brest, is because there's been a massive typhus outbreak on the Brittany Peninsula. So that's your warships are based in a place that's now ravaged by typhus, which has done another number on all of your crews. So the French have an experience deficit, I think it's fair to say, isn't it? And that really comes into play in what's going on. I mean, in ship terms, what are we looking at in terms of relative composition of forces here?
So it's one of the closest to even in terms of overall fleet numbers. The British have about 24 ships of the line, a handful of frigates, but frigates don't really take part in full-on naval actions. The French have slightly fewer ships. They're 2 or 3 less, depending on exactly how you're counting things. But the interesting thing is actually looking at the firepower, because the French fleet, although they don't have the biggest ship present, because the single biggest ship present is the Royal George, the British flagship, which is the only first rate that's there. The French have a mixture of 80 gunners, 74 gunners, 70 gunners, and 64 gunners, because they've really been leading the way. They invented the 74-gun ship of the line, they invented the 80-gun ship of the line, and so overall, they have ships with heavier firepower. The British, they have a couple of second rates, so they're the only ones with 3-deckers, which not quite parallels Trafalgar, but the French didn't show up to Trafalgar with 3-deckers either, but the Spanish did. But once you get past their initial run of a few 3-deckers and some 74s and 70s, you start to see a lot of 60-gun and 50-gun ships at the lower end of things. So, and that's more reflective of the fact that through various things, the initial attempts, the rating system to standardize ship production, French attempts to one-up them, the fact that obviously it's cheaper to build and maintain 50 or 60 gunners compared to 70, 74, 80 gunners, it means that although the British technically have the numbers advantage, in terms of overall firepower, it's very close. And if you end up with a 50 gunner going up against a French 80, obviously there's a huge firepower disparity, because it's not just number of guns, but the bigger the ship, the more heavy guns it's also going to be carrying. And also the French, there's also a little bit of a design difference that's coming in, which you'll see more and more as the Age of Sail goes on. But essentially, because the French ships aren't actually having to sail for as long, they're gradually drifting towards the idea of longer, faster, more heavily armed ships, which are fantastic for about 3 months. And then they've worked themselves so loose they have to go back in for heavy refit. Whereas the British, now focusing a lot on blockade and long-distance cruising, are having to build ships that are just ever so slightly shorter, which makes them considerably stronger structurally. And it also makes them more agile, slightly slower in most cases, and obviously very slightly less well-armed, but much more suited for long-term operations.
I think that's a really good thing to point out, is that in weight of firepower terms, this is in theory on paper. Like, I'm always wary of the kind of the world of warshipification of kind of naval battles and tank battles as well. In this sense of going, well, if this ship comes up against this ship will always win. And I think this battle is fascinating, or what happens around this period is fascinating, because it really highlights that so much of it is variable factors coming into it. You can have 2 ships that on paper are equivalent, but as you say, one actually might have a significant weight of firepower greater than the other one, but the other one might have it might just be better maintained. They might be better crewed. And these things can counteract each other. And they also, I think, play into the confidence of the commanders and how confident a commander is in what they can use their forces for.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll go on to see that in the actual battle. The seamanship is absolutely vital in any battle, especially vital in this one. And when it comes to firepower, when you're at close range, yes, in theory, you might look at a French ship and go, okay, well, it's got more and heavier guns, so its broadside weight is, I don't know, 40, 50, 60% heavier than the British ship it's fighting. But if the British ship can fire twice for every French single broadside, actually the weight of fire advantage lays with the British. And because they're then technically firing more shots per unit of time, it actually gives them more chances to hit. And this is a period where, outside of extremely weird circumstances, you're not talking about a World War I, World War II scenario where a single hit could potentially decimate a ship. You're wearing them down by numerous shots. And the more shots you put in, the more chances you have to dismount guns, take out people on the tiller or the wheel, depending on the scale of the ship, and all these kind of things that can cripple the combat effectiveness of a ship very quickly, or take out a mast, something like that.
So let's get into the battle. So almost our kind of story, the lead up to this battle almost starts. The battle happens in November, but the lead up almost starts in the summer. It starts with August. I mean, we talked earlier about the ever-present blockade and how Hawke's approaching this, and that's really happening from sort of August onwards. He knows that they're going to try and invade. He's maintaining this blockade of Brest, and that's been continuous. The French have been trying to get out of this port and do this for a long time. And they've been trying to concentrate forces. They've been trying to bring in forces from the Mediterranean to back up that fleet. They've been trying to bring forces back from the West Indies to do it. And they've been blocked in various ways in trying to do that. So, but late November is when it really all shifts, isn't it? This is when it all starts to come together. And a lot of that is down to the weather, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. So the weather, obviously, there's a certain amount of weather you can stick with in the Atlantic on blockade. But the Atlantic is a very vicious sea. So once the weather gets too bad, blockading forces have to fall back. And this is what happens. The main fleet has to drop back to home waters because there's a really, really nasty winter gale. That means there's a relatively reduced number of ships off of the French coast. The French go, okay, here's our opportunity. The minute the wind shifts, they're coming out. The British forces realize that there is very little they can do to stop them at this point because they're massively outnumbered and outgunned at that point. So they send off ships to try and warn the main fleet under Hawke that, hey, the French are coming out. And that doesn't actually work. It's a good idea. They send out multiple ships. The weather is just so awful that not only are those ships struggling to progress, but the ships they're trying to reach, they don't know where they are. And this isn't the era of GPS. So it's a case of, well, we're sailing roughly in this direction, and when we get to roughly where we think they should be, we have to start looking. And of course, if that fleet's been or squadron's been blown out of position, you're just looking in the wrong place, assuming you ever got to the right place in the first place.
So on the 14th of November, what we're looking at here is where the situation is you've got de Brienne with his fleet, the French fleet. They're almost sat off of Brest. They're sat actually a bit out into the Atlantic, because as you said, they've had the winds, they've been able to come out. And it's probably best, listeners, if you assume that the default status of wind for the rest of this podcast, we will mention it at various points, is a massive running gale that you would not want to get to Channel Ferry in. Like, no, yes. you'd be feeling a bit sickly on a modern Channel Ferry in this weather. And this entire battle and this entire sequence of events is going to happen in multiple variants of that weather. So de Brienne's sitting off the French coast, waiting for that wind change so that he can get back to pick up and rendezvous with his invasion forces that are in that armpit of Brittany. And as you say, Drac, the British forces that have been maintaining that blockade, which I think was a squadron of 550s, they've tried to reach out and warn Hawke, who's retreated to Torbay to kind of see out the gale-force winds that they're coming. But actually, I think the ship that finally gets through to him is exactly what you said earlier. It's because he'd set up this network of victualers, these ships that come out and tell him. I love British ship names for the simple fact that we are absolutely troll the world in how we name ships. So, every naval battle, particularly you get to World War II or World War I, and it's always like the Admiral von Ripper from Germany versus HMS Honeybun from Britain or something. So the ship that actually successfully warns Hawke that the French are out and they're trying to invade is the Love and Unity, which is just the most Care Bear name for a ship ever.
Yeah, and it's a chartered Admiralty supply ship. It's carrying weapons of war and supplies and gunpowder. And it's like, no, we're here to spread love and unity at very high velocities.
Yeah. You will love and you will be unified. But so they managed to warn Hawke, and that's they're on the 15th. And Hawke, as you say, this is the advantage the British have, is the winds generally favour them. So he leaves at that point. He's now headed to try and intercept the French fleet. So to set the scenes for the listeners, imagine Hawke is now heading down from around Cornwall. You've got de Brienne waiting for the weather to change, and it's now just about changed. So he's now heading towards that armpit of Brittany, which again is stopping me ever being welcomed in Brittany again, to try and pick up his fleet. There is a small British fleet that's off of Vannes, isn't there? That's the one that de Brienne's going to encounter first.
Yes. Yeah, so he shows up, and this is Admiral Duff, and he's mostly been assigned to essentially catch the occasional ship that might be trying to come up from Bordeaux or Roquefort, and to keep an eye on the transport. So he doesn't need a particularly powerful force, and being slightly further south, he's avoided the worst of the storms that are further north. But then here comes the main French fleet. So he just takes one look at it and goes, yeah, there's no point to trying to stand up to this, and scatters his fleet, which obviously then means it gives the French clear passage, but it also means that the British forces can then loop back and try and tell Hawke, who's coming in, what's going on. And also obviously means that any frigates with him can keep an eye on exactly where the French are.
And he sort of does something rather smart, I always think. He doesn't just scatter them. He effectively scatters them very deliberately in two directions. So he scatters to the north and he scatters to the south. And part of that, as you say, is to try and create that link with Hawke, because he's working from a confidence position that if the French are out, Hawke probably knows about it and is probably heading down. So there's almost a bit, I mean, one day we will do Jutland. And there's a little bit here, I think, of Duff successfully does what Beatty thinks he's doing at Jutland. There's one for anyone familiar with naval history. But Duff's forces headed north and his forces headed south means that de Brienne effectively decides almost to split his force, doesn't he, to try and see if he would engage and just chase down some of Duff's ships.
Yeah, and he knows he's not going to be able to get all of them. So eventually, between the lead and the scattering, de Brienne, sometimes often called Conflans because he's the Comte de Conflans, he eventually realizes, look, I'm not going to catch these ships. Also, I've got a job to do. And this sort of comes back to what you were saying about the fact Conflans or de Brienne, he's not an incompetent officer. He does his best when he sees an opportunity to contact the enemy, but then he realizes, now, hang on a minute, my mission here is to pick up the transports. I've got to get my ships back together and get there, because that's the whole point of this exercise.
I think one thing he does incredibly well that actually a lot of future French commanders won't is he's quick in recognizing he's not dealing with the main British battle fleet. The initial reports he gets when he encounters Duff is that this is a large British fleet, and he's smart and he's quick and he realizes, hang on, no, this is a blockade force. I need to stop chasing it down, and as you say, I need to reconcentrate. And I need to get on with my job quickly because I bet the British are coming in force.
Yeah. And then this sets up what I think is probably one of the most cinematic moments in naval history, because the French are sort of gathering themselves back together. And although the weather, as we said, generally is pretty awful, it's kind of what we would describe in Britain as very blowy, and there's scattered rain showers and everything. It's not pleasant to be in, but it's not awful. It's not a risk to life and limb unless you're really stupid. And then the other thing that makes de Brienne decide he's going to reconstitute his fleet is he's looked at the northwest horizon and he can see this towering slate grey storm front of immense proportions bearing down on him. And he's like, okay, that is a threat to life and limb. This is also why we need to get into port ASAP. And so they're heading kind of, roughly speaking, southeast-ish. And then somebody on one of the French ships looks at the horizon and sees bright white sails silhouetted against this almost black, some of the accounts describe as clouds. And they can see, obviously, the sea is building out to the northwest as well. And literally on the crest, riding the front of this massive storm system, comes the British fleet with all flags and sails flying.
Led by Admiral Hawke, which is the silliest name that you would never let as a screenwriter them name the admiral, because it's too on the money. But yeah, like, listener, imagine the Hans Zimmer soundtrack rising at this point, because as Drax says, yeah, you've got that British fleet riding almost that crest of this immense storm descending on Conflans, on the Brienne, and you're just like, I wouldn't. That is not a situation you want to be in, particularly as a competent French admiral, because you know that whatever your on paper strength, you're in trouble here.
Yeah. And this kind of also, it shows the difference in both attitude and skill of both British commanders and sailors, because the French fleet is in rough but relatively speaking calm waters, and they're sailing under regular sail. And when they see the British coming, they realize they have to go into battle sail. So for those unaware, battle sails, essentially the biggest sails, the lowest sails get furled, partly to reduce strain on the mast, partly to clear the gun decks, and partly because you don't want to be running at full speed in a battle, in theory at least, because then you run the risk of collision, overrun, and it becomes very hard to maneuver. Whereas the British, who are riding on the crest of this driving gale, which is very quickly escalating into a full-on Atlantic storm, when Hawke sees the French, his initial thought is, okay, we have to do the standard thing. We have to form a battle line. But between the fact that if you form a battle line, you also have to go into battle sail, and it takes time for everybody to maneuver properly, he realizes, well, actually, by the time we've done this, the French will probably have escaped. So he very quickly abandons that idea. So he has a few ships forming his battle line. It's depending on exactly when in the chase. It's between 6 and 10 ships. But he abandons that idea and just hoists general chase, which for anyone who's been in the Royal Navy, like, the signal general chase has huge meaning. And the interesting thing about this is general chase is usually done at the end of a battle when the enemy is broken and fleeing, and is usually avoided earlier than that because it breaks up your formation, because it's essentially every man for himself at the enemy. And Hawke is hoisting general chase before they've even started engaging, because he's essentially like, everyone just go at them as hard as you possibly can. And despite the fact they're in the middle of this building storm, you have the British ships hoisting every scrap of canvas they possibly can. Is they don't really care that much about the fact their ships are bobbing up and down like corks. What they care about is they want to get into close contact with the French as soon as possible. And you get this race developing between the faster ships of essentially, yes, I want to fight the French, but also I want to be the first. So everyone's racing each other. And at one point, because during these kinds of battles, the ship's boats are put over the back and just attached by a heavy cable to avoid them becoming splinter risks, and also things like furniture and stuff get put in them. And at one point, one of the ships is running along, and the force of the sea is so great that this massive, like 2-inch thick cable just snaps, and the boats are being falling behind. And the captain just kind of looks at it and goes, "Well, at least we're going faster now."
This is, and again, to give people a visual image of what's happening here, as Drax says. So you've got the British coming in at full sail, on riding the crest of this Atlantic storm behind them, and what the Brienne's doing here is behind him, behind Van, where he's aiming for is Quiberon Bay. This is a relatively sheltered bay in that kind of the bottom end of Brittany, and actually it's a smart move on his part, because there's two things that can happen here that he's hoping will play into his favour. If he can get his entire fleet into there, firstly, they're in theory a bit better protected. He's hoping that one of two things will happen. Either Hawke will not follow him in at all, because he has charts for that bay. The British do not. This is not a calm bay. There are shoals. There are giant rocks on the outside that they need to move past, which gives the French name for the battle. And if Hawke follows him in, he's hoping that the fact that they will be in close quarters will neutralize any advantage the British has. So you've got this race going on between him under battle sail, trying to get into the bay, and Hawke, as you say, with the British in hot pursuit. And I knew full well when you suggested doing this, and when we talked about doing this, exactly why you wanted to do it. Drac, do you want to name the ship that fired the first shot officially in the battle?
Yes, it is, of course, Warspite. predecessor by several generations to the famous World War I and World War II battleship. But yeah, everybody's jockeying for position, and Warspite manages to get just far enough ahead that everyone's going, they're probably in gun range around about now. But with the weather and the ship's pitching, everyone realizes there's no chance of actually hitting. And so all the captains are kind of going, okay, are we close enough now? Are we close enough now? Are we close enough now? And yeah, according to most of the logs, it's Warspite that finally breaks the impasse by opening up with its chase guns. And then you get, this battle is so full of cinematic moments. We'll come on to more of them later. But another one, you've got this audience on the hills and the cliffside nearby who've all shown up despite the weather to see what's going on. You also have something that, according to at least some of the French accounts, has a slightly unintended morale effect on the French, because as everybody is getting to the point where chase guns are now opening up, Hawke shifts his signal from general chase to general attack. But this is a period where, although you have the start of what we would understand as the modern signaling system, it's not as complicated as it will be by the time of Nelson. And so the signal for general attack is just to hoist a massive great red banner on the flagship's mast, which is a fairly easy to understand thing. Big red banner, okay, we go and attack. For the French morale, the French, for people who even look back as far as Crécy, Agincourt, and Poitiers, the French military has a tradition of flying what they call the oriflamme, which is a massive great red banner, admittedly with a golden sun on it, which essentially means no quarter will be given in this battle. And there's some of the French sailors look at this massive red banner coming at them on the horizon, and they think this is the British flying an equivalent of the oriflamme, and they're like, oh, this isn't going to end.
Yeah, this is not going to end. This is to go cinematic. The closest I heard someone once describe it as that bit in the second Lord of the Rings film where Gandalf just appears on the top of a hill at Helm's Deep with all that cavalry and it just descends. It's almost like that rolling feel to it. And when you say that there's people watching on the side, I mean, we're not talking like 500 people just gathered on hills. Because of the nature of this bay, because of the nature of the terrain around there, everyone is out watching this. So there's some reports of up to like 10,000 French citizens are almost watching this battle. And at some points dodging shot because of how close this is fought as they're watching this. So the French are now let's say the French are just about reaching the entrance to the bay and they're getting in. So are the British starting to catch them up at this point? When does the engagement really start?
Yeah, so it's basically the main engagement starts as the French fleet is passing through what they call the cardinals, the big rocks that mark the entrance to the bay. And you see this again, because it's no disrespect to the French officers, you see this happening time again and again. French officers preparing to sacrifice themselves and their ship in an attempt to delay the British, because they realize just how dangerous fighting a battle going through the passage is going to be, and they're hoping to delay the British just long enough so that the French fleet can get into the relatively sheltered waters and then essentially form a big line to receive the incoming ships. So you have the chef d'escadre, which is the squadron commander of the 3rd French Division, the wonderfully named Louis de Saint-André de Vergères, and he's commanding the Formidable, which is a French 80-gunner. It's the head of the 3rd Division. And he decides that as the biggest ship and the leader of the 3rd Squadron, which is the rear guard, he's going to put his ship at the entrance and he's going to try and use his superior firepower to attack and delay the first British ships. And he's essentially doing a last stand to let everyone get to safety. Unfortunately for him, the vast majority of the British ships just go, oh, okay, there's a target, fine, and just come steaming past him under full sail, exchange a few broadsides, and keep going, which means that the Formidable can't bring its superior firepower to bear because it can only get a couple of salvos off before that target is passed and the fresh target has shown up. Meanwhile, Formidable is being hit every couple of minutes by numerous salvos and gets worn down very quickly. Eventually, the Resolution comes alongside and Formidable surrenders, but she only surrenders when essentially every officer who's above the gun decks is dead. And the last few French crewmen are kind of standing around going, well, literally no one is alive to give us orders anymore. and the wind is now blowing us towards the shoals. It's, better to surrender than die horribly. So you have that, and then as the other British ships, both in the lead and in sort of the middle, start to overhaul various French ships, you get a bunch of single ship actions developing. And these are a variety of running fights, which means that people are slowing down to maneuver and to keep in arc of the others. And this allows other British ships to come past. So the Royal George, the flagship, is kind of in the middle of the chase, but then she starts bypassing ships that were ahead of her, which are now engaged in various individual fights. So you have the Torbay under Captain Keppel, and she's in a huge fight with Thisay, and it's actually going fairly evenly. And then you see this example of seamanship, because as anyone who's been at sea will know, in a storm you have big waves, and then occasionally you have really big waves. And they are both actually fighting broadside to the wind, which means they're pitching and rolling absolutely awful. But Keppel looks to port, his unengaged side, and he sees this monstrous wave coming into the bay. And he thinks, this is not a good thing at all. But he's in very confined water, so his ability to maneuver is limited. If he turns to starboard, he's going to end up ramming Thisay, and he's going to get the wave coming in on his stern. But if he turns away too early, turns into the wave, he's exposing his stern to being raked. And he's essentially standing on his, what we would later call the bridge, but it's the poop deck at that point. And he's looking left and right, left and right, left and right, judging the timing. And he judges the timing absolutely perfectly. Superb. You've got Torbay and Thisay, and Torbay drops into the trough of the last wave, at which point he orders the wheel hard over, and Torbay just about gets her bow round as this huge wave comes in. Torbay rises like a rocket. Some of the French survivors describe it basically disappearing skywards as she rides this massive wave. Thisay is maybe 30 seconds too slow, and she's just about starting to come about when this massive wave just smashes into her. She's got all her gun ports open because she's been fighting Torbay up until a few moments earlier, and the water just pours in through every gun port she's got. And if you thought the Mary Rose went down quickly, Thisay basically just drops out like a stone, straight underwater, and within moments, her hull hatchie hits the bottom of Quiberon Bay. The tops of her masts are left above the water with a handful of survivors clinging to them. Torbay, with Keppel on board, rides over this wave, comes back down again, has to then haul hard to starboard, because otherwise he's going to run into the shoals. And then in something that is very much, emblematic of the age of sail, 2 minutes earlier, he'd been trying to kill everybody aboard Thisay. Now that Thisay is a wreck and there's a handful of people clinging for survival against a storm, he actually pulls Torbay to and puts boats out to go and save them. I wouldn't have wanted to be a boat crew being told that was my mission now. But Torbay, he essentially goes, okay, boats, you go and recover survivors. I'm off to find another target. And off he goes.
And I think this is such, to me, and again, for listeners, I think you could really imagine is everyone on these cruises almost having to do double duty here. Normally, you're either having to be a very good sailor or a very good fighter. On a very broad level, you're crewing your ship or you're crewing your positions on your ship differently in a battle. Hence the talk of battle sail versus full sail and things, versus you would if you're having to fight a storm. Now, they are two entirely different exercises, and you are trained to do different things in those circumstances. This whole battle is happening in the middle of the winds that you should be in the middle of doing your anti-sinking from the everyone is fighting two enemies here. They're fighting their opponent, and they're fighting the weather. There is no greater testament to British seamanship in this period, I think, than what happens here. The French are not bad at this, but it's only Hawke would have taken his ships in to do this.
Yeah, and you get a kind of a measure of the kind of man that Hawke is, because the Royal George goes past this fight and then sinking between Torbay and Thisay, and is basically having to dodge dueling ships in a narrow, confined environment with huge waves on either side. She's a 3-decker first-rate ship of the line. She's the least maneuverable ship there. And the ship's master is trying to conduct all these maneuvers, any one of which would be very difficult, complicated by the fact that people are taking pot shots out left, right, and center. So there's cannonballs shooting across the decks. And at one point, he turns around to Hawke and essentially says, look, we've got to slow down, because if we keep going this way, we are going to end up wrecked. And Hawke just turns round to him and says, well, you've now done your duty in appraising me of the danger. Let us next see how well you can comply with my orders. I say, lay me alongside the French admiral, who's at the head of the French column. And so the poor ship's master is trying to guide this massive behemoth, essentially doing a Dodgems course in a storm.
It's the Captain Kirkiest line of the era, I think.
Yeah. And it gets even more ridiculous because the lead elements of the French fleet have actually made it into Quiberon Bay. So Conflans de Brienne, he does two things. He looks back and realizes the rear echelons of his fleet are getting completely chewed to pieces. He also sees this massive looming shape of the Royal George coming at him, and visibility is dropping as the storm gets worse and worse and worse. So he turns 14 ships, including his flagship, around and basically tells them, come back the other way, and we're going to try and reinforce our friends. And the Royal George at this point has burst through the main area of combat and is bearing down. And you end up with this kind of, it's almost like a medieval joust. You have the Soleil Royal coming one way, the Royal George coming the other way. And as the visibility drops, almost no one further back can actually see what's going on, to the point that at one point the British think the Royal George has been lost, because they're like, well, he went charging off after half the French fleet. There's no way he's survived. And at some point during this charge, Conflans' idea is essentially to get as close as possible. Then everyone will simultaneously turn, present massive broadsides, and rip Royal George apart. That starts to happen, but the wind and the waves are so terrible that there's a storm of cannon fire, but almost none of it is actually hitting Royal George. Then the Intrepide goes, yeah, you're an 80 gunner. Royal George is a 100 gunner. That's not going to end well for you. Intrepide tries to interpose herself to save the Soleil Royal as Royal George pulls up broadside and gets absolutely hammered for her trouble. She ends up dropping out of line. The French fleet slightly repositioned, so Royal George goes into charge again. And at that point, you have the Superb, who sees the Intrepide is basically out of action and goes, okay, I'm now going to take the position to save the French flagship. The only problem for her is between the weather and the maneuvers, she comes up on what had previously been Royal George's unengaged side, which has been loaded with double shot for an initial devastating assault. And the crew of the Royal George are very annoyed at this point because they've dodged through the main battle, which was, that's an achievement in and of itself. They've now been thwarted once, trying to take the Soleil Royal by the Intrepide. Now they're being thwarted again as Superb interposes herself. And so Superb comes up basically heading in the opposite direction. Royal George's crew unleash this ferocious broadside that was designed to rip apart an 80-gun ship of the line. Superb has the terrible luck of catching it just as she's riding up on a wave, and it rips her side open. I mean, it's as bad, if not worse, than what Victory does to Redoutable at Trafalgar. And so Superb is in a bad way almost immediately. Royal George's gunners reload and deliver a second broadside incredibly quickly. And Superb rides up on another wave. She takes the second broadside. She's already rolling quite badly from the water that's pouring in from the holes from the first. And the way that the crew on the Royal George describe is they essentially see her roll heavily away. They see this massive second broadside land. Superb just dips down the back end of this big wave that she's been riding, starts to go. They can see her starting to go over as she goes down, and then she's just lost to sight. And it appears she just dove down that wave into the trough and just kept going straight down, and there's no survivors from the Superb. She's basically one of the very, very few HSL ships that's ripped apart and sunk in a matter of maybe 2 minutes. Conflans sees this, and the rest of the French fleet conclude, well, there is no way anyone would take one ship against 14. Now, okay, he's taken out 2 and we're down to 12, but still there's no way he could possibly win this. He must have the rest of the British fleet coming up right behind him. And as I said, the visibility is constantly dropping. And at this point, that's entirely plausible because they can barely see the Royal George. So Conflans decides, okay, change of plans. We're going to head further into the bay. We're going to find some shelter because there's nothing we can do at this point. And so you get this rather hilarious situation of 12 French ships of the line with one British ship chasing them, basically going, come back here, I want to fight you. A big island looms up in the middle of the bay, out of the murk. The French fleet goes, okay, dodge to port. The Royal George at that point has been angling to try and unleash a broadside, so she's pointing in slightly the wrong direction, can't follow safely, so she goes off to starboard. And that means that the majority of that French force then manages to head off further into the bay for safety. Hawke, it just turns around and goes, okay, well, darned, he didn't get the French flagship. Let's go back and find somebody else to shoot. And the visibility drops to a point where basically no one can see more than a couple of 100 yards away. So even though Conflans ships are heading into the bay, theoretically in a line, Soleil Royale actually gets quite badly battered on the way because other French ships just appear, less than a ship's length away from them and are bouncing off her sides they're colliding and so forth. And eventually it gets to a point where even Hawke turns around and says, look, we literally can't see anything. Ships are appearing and disappearing before we even get a chance to work out who they are. And so he hoists flags for what good that'll do, lanterns, and fires signal guns, which essentially mean, okay, drop anchor, ride out what's left of the storm.
And that's really where a lot of the kind of the major battle finishes, isn't it? And it's worth saying to people, this has been a running battle now since about 8:30 in the morning. I think that's roughly when the first shots are fired, and we've now reached a point, because these things, we talk about these as very fast-moving engagements, and they are when you get those gunnery duels. But if you think of this as these ships are often turning and shifting fast, but it does play out over hours, a lot of this. And I think it's Hawke who complains bitterly afterwards that if he had 2 more hours of daylight, he reckons he'd have got all of the ships, doesn't he?
Yeah. And by this point, it's dark. There's spray everywhere. The waves are heaving. And to give you some idea of just how ridiculously low the visibility is at this point, the following day, when the weather starts to break and light starts to come back onto the field, they actually discover that there's a bunch of French ships scattered in among the British ships at what would normally be point blank cannon range. But in the weather the previous night, they couldn't see a whole ship that was 300 yards away from them, which then leads to this slightly comical kind of everyone looking around going, the French going, we shouldn't be here, and hoisting sail as fast as possible. And other British ships going, oh, we should probably chase them, which actually leads to a bunch of ships going aground in the morning. And so the battle kind of actually ends technically the following morning with brief exchanges of gunfire and a few ships hitting shoals and so forth. And so as it finally ends and Hawke looks around, he realizes, okay, well, what's left of the French fleet has now up a river, so we can't really pursue because a lot of the French ships have jettisoned guns to lighten themselves enough to clear the bar at the entrance to the river. And he decides, okay, we're gonna make good. We've captured some ships, we've sunk some ships, we've got 1 or 2 of our own aground. We'll salvage what we can, and then we'll head back out to sea. And he starts writing up his report, which is extremely welcome in Britain because it's kind of it's a 3-phase victory in that it's in and of itself, it's a dramatic victory over a French fleet. It's also scuppered the French invasion plans, and it's come at a time when, globally speaking, Britain maybe wasn't necessarily doing quite so well. So it's also a huge morale boost for them.
It's one of the victories in what becomes known as the sort of the annus mirabilis, this kind of a miracle year that turns the war around for the British. Because while the British have been winning, they've been losing battles and everything else. Economically, they've been winning. Militarily, they haven't necessarily been as strong. And I think that's where it is worth us kind of finishing up by rounding up what those consequences are. I think is that the French have been broadly winning in what is modern Canada at this point. And what this does, because of the effect it has on the available French shipping, on the ability, the French never managed to break the blockade again. This is it, and that's both militarily and economically. This is the turning point for the war, because after this, the French economy never recovers. France will default on all of its loans very shortly after this, which is not what you want to be doing in the middle of a war. And They can't reinforce their forces in French Canada. That the victories they've won there sort of bleed away because they can't take advantage of them. So in a weird way, this is, if you want to know why the British end up dominant in Canada, it's not General Wolfe's victory at Quebec that does it. It's this battle. It stops them getting there. I mean, there's sort of consequences for the Royal Navy as well. It becomes like, we talked about this being a bit forgotten in the public mentality. It's absolutely not forgotten in the Royal Navy's mentality, is it?
No, it sets the tone, because this is kind of around the period where you have, slightly before this, Admiral Byng being shot for supposedly not doing his utmost in the face of the enemy, and Hawke, in every experienced sailor who's reading the reports of what he's done, realizes this should never have worked. This was a suicidal gambit. But through courage, boldness, and the skill of the British sailors, he's managed to pull it off. And it kind of sets a bar of like, this is what it means to do your utmost in the face of the enemy, which then means that when you see future battles, both in the rest of the 7 Years' War and subsequently, people have this standard of, we can't blame it on the weather. We can't blame it on having slightly less powerful ships. You just have to attack. And that in and of itself, that mindset is half the battle a lot of the time. You kind of see an echo of this at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, where John Jervis is leading with Nelson as one of his captains. And he is actually very outnumbered, and that the estimates of Spanish sail of the line go up and up and up, and eventually just turns around to the person who's reporting these and basically tells them, just stop telling me how many ships there are. I'll attack them even if there are 50. And that's an attitude which in many ways is either born or massively enhanced by Quiberon Bay, and the fact that Hawke sets this example which pretty much everyone has to follow, because it's also not a case of, like you'd have in the Napoleonic Wars, of Nelson and this brash young captain taking risks when maybe he shouldn't. This is a very experienced fleet admiral with everything reputationally and fleet-wise to lose, who is absolutely, has no hesitation about just going straight for the jugular.
I read a really good paper, if I can find a link anywhere, I'll stick it into the show notes afterwards, but it was talking about the consequences on culture for both the British Navy and the French Navy as in this period. And it really highlighted this battle. And it said, and I always thought this summed it up really nicely, said that this was the point where Royal Navy culture shifted to, at the beginning of a battle, the expectation is we will win. And for the French, it shifted the expectation the other way to the expectation is we might win. And that would be the case for the next 100 years in terms of every naval engagement you get for the British and the French. The British are almost going in with a morale boost because there is an expectation that they will do a thing. And the French are going in with a morale deficit because they're just innately conscious that they can be ship for ship the right match. But there is history that demonstrates being ship for ship a match for the Royal Navy is not enough. And I suppose we should maybe finish by just saying that and talking about the French Navy in a bit. I do again want to say is I don't think Conflans de Brienne does anything. I don't see what he could have done differently. I mean, do you feel there's anything he could have done differently?
No, because if he'd stayed out to sea and turned his ship's broadside on to meet Hawke coming the other way, theoretically that would have given him a line where the British would have been a bit scattered, but he would have been broadside on to the storm in open seas, which would have just been inviting multiple occurrences of what happened to Thesay, and the only way they could have countered that would have been to shut at least their lower gun decks, which more than halves their firepower, at which point they would just be taken apart in the open sea. So, I mean, against anyone who wasn't, almost suicidally reckless, his plan should have worked. He carefully picked his way through an area of essentially difficult terrain, which he knew his enemy didn't. By all metrics, he should have been able to enter the bay, form his line, and receive scattered forces that made their way through as half of them smashed themselves on the rocks. There's no real way for him at that point to have anticipated that the British would come charging in under full sail and their sole means of navigation would be, well, the French went that way, so clearly that's where the rocks aren't. So, yeah, it's about the only thing he could possibly have done, which might have bought him half an hour, which might have given him just enough time to get his fleet into the bay, would have been to completely ignore Duff's squadron. But that is looking back with hindsight, knowing what was going to come. At the point that he sees Duff's squadron, he doesn't know exactly where Falk is. He knows he's somewhere nearby, but he doesn't know he's right there. And also, as we said earlier, going after Duff's squadron until he realized he wasn't going to catch it was the right thing to do. He had found an enemy force that eventually turns out to be less powerful than his. As a naval officer, that his duty is to try and attack them if he can. If he'd turned around and said, well, actually, no, we're just going to ignore them and press on completely, he would have been open to reasonably justified accusations of cowardice. So it's one of those, it's very easy to armchair admiral from the 21st century. Oh, well, if you'd done this, this would have happened.
You always have to think of these things through what is the informational landscape that the commander in place has, what is the cultural landscape that they have, and what is the orders landscape that they have. And I think when you take all those three things together, I don't think he makes a single misstep in that entire, broadly, not a major misstep. I think sometimes there's a Captain Picard meme that from Star Trek that does rounds every now and again, which is sometimes you can make all the right decisions and still lose. And I think that's very much what happens to the French here. They are extraordinarily brave. They are well commanded. They just cannot deal with Hawke and the Navy. So maybe just to as our final thought, do you think the French Navy ever recovers from this?
They try. They're constantly in a rebuild. They constantly try and rebuild, but they never quite pick themselves back up again. I mean, you will see things like the Battle of Chesapeake Bay at the end of the American Revolution, where de Grasse manages to hold off a British force, but then that's immediately followed up by the Saints, where they lose horribly. And it essentially, you have this, what we mentioned at the beginning of this problem of you've lost a bunch of ships, you've lost a bunch of men, that's reset your skilled sailor pool down yet again, and you've lost some of your bravest officers as well. So you're constantly having to rebuild, almost the same with the way the Japanese had to constantly rebuild their fleet air arms in the Second World War. And admittedly, obviously, you can build new ships. That's not necessarily a problem for France. But it's building that tradition, it's building that core of skilled sailors, and they just keep getting knocked back. So, but Quiberon Bay is a really, really big knock to them, especially because it happens off of their own coast. It's also, it comes at a time where you have this slightly weird, almost self-sabotage that's going on within the French Navy. So one of the things probably people won't be aware of is that in the early to mid part of the 1700s, so the 18th century, the French Navy is actually relatively meritocratic. They have the whole, you have to be this noble to be an officer thing that most navies have. But that's one part of their naval officer structure. The other part is you can rise through the ranks, you can be almost a nobody, and if you're skilled enough, you can become a captain or an admiral. And that is where a lot of these officers are coming from. Obviously, Conflans is a count, so he is one of the nobility. But a number of other French officers who are very competent aren't. But around about this time and going forward, while they're trying to rebuild from the losses of the 7 Years' War, you also have this issue of a lot of, not all, but a lot of the nobility have chosen shore positions, masters of dockyards and so forth, because it allows them to be part of the French social scene. It allows them to be at home in their luxury environments while also having a naval career. Whereas obviously the people who don't have much, they'd rather be out at sea. So what French successes there are going more and more to the meritocratic rather than the aristocratic officers. And the aristocratic officers go, we don't like the fact that the peasants, the up-jumped ones, are getting the glory. And rather than realize, well, that's because the majority of them are out at sea and you're sitting in a dockyard, they go, well, clearly the solution is we need to choke off that line and make the officer corps almost entirely aristocratic, which obviously denies them access to a lot of competent officers who would otherwise perhaps come up to replace those who had been lost. But it also means that when the revolution comes, almost all the officer corps is aristocratic, and then regardless of whether they're competent or not, a lot of them either get executed or driven into exile, which means the French Navy takes this double hit going into the Napoleonic Wars of they've lost almost all the meritocratic officers, and the line for those to be developed has been shut down. And they've now lost, any aristocratic officers who knew what they're doing have probably been beheaded. So they've got a very, very small surviving core of a few aristocrats who have kind of proven that they're loyal to the ideals of the revolution. But the meritocratic promotions are essentially starting from ground zero again. And that means that going into the Napoleonic Wars, they have a real leadership deficit. It's not quite party loyalty levels of leadership, but you kind of see that even by the time of Trafalgar, which is 10, 15 years into the conflict, you have people who by that point have reached captain level, who are very competent. They know exactly what they're doing, but there just hasn't been the time to raise them to flag command levels.
And I think what you see with that is even those aristocratic officers that do maintain their rank during the revolutionary period and beyond, they're never entirely trusted. They're not allowed to operate with the independence that they really need to be effective commanders. I mean, there's a great quote about the consequences of this, and both of us know. Do you want to take the honor of taking us out with that quote? But before we do, where can people find you, Drac?
So obviously you can find me mostly online on YouTube at the YouTube channel Drakinifel. That's where most of my work is done. If you want, you can pick up a book I've recently done. I've done a book on HMS Belfast with the US Navy Institute. I also have a website, which is usefully, coordinated branding, drakinifel.uk, where you can find, I'm gradually scanning and uploading various naval photos that I've got. So if you want some free high-res naval photos, you can find them there. It's also got a schedule of places that I go to visit, conferences that I'm running. I'm running a conference actually at the time of this recording, about just over a week, which is sold out, which is quite nice. And next time we can do a bigger one.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the next one as well. I mean, I'll be at this one. And I do want to emphasize that the photo archive that you've built up on your own website is an absolute treasure. If you are a historian or even just interested in naval history, just go on, look at the photos. There's so many photos that, I mean, I've used that collection a lot. It's just don't miss out on it.
And there's plenty more to come. I have literally cubic meters of photos that need scanning.
There's one of us, for those who are familiar with both of us, will know that we occasionally can be found running around on ships together, and there's always almost a bit of a race between us to see if we can find the hidden ship's archive photos that always lurks somewhere in the wardroom, and get some copies of them. But yeah, I mean, do you want to lead us up with what the external verdict is on the French Navy after this?
This is a quote from a French naval historian, somewhat after the battle. And he says, "The Battle of the Cardinals," which is their name for Quiberon Bay, it says, "was the grave of the French Navy in the reign of Louis XV. The troops at Morbihan had to be dispersed. All part plans for the Channel and the North Sea had to be abandoned. And this meant the ruin of all our hopes and of our last chance of salvation. But painful as it was not perhaps as cruel as the humiliations which we were now have to suffer on all sides. We possessed no means of opposition. After Lagos and Quiberon, France had no more squadrons in either the Mediterranean or the Atlantic. Hawke, whose boldness combined with methodical calculation foreshadowed the warlike genius of Nelson, exploited his victory in striking fashion by spreading terror along the whole coast of Biscay." And that, of course, is complemented by a Royal Navy toast, which just says, "May our officers have the eye of a hawk and the heart of a wolf."
Well, I think that's the perfect place to finish. So thanks for listening, everyone. Like, subscribe. If you've got comments on this, don't forget to chat on our various platforms on which you can chat. And I will see you all next week. You've been listening to the Untitled History Podcast, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, why not head over to our dedicated supporter page? There, for the cost of a cup of tea, you can decide which subjects we cover next, get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and join a community of like-minded people. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.